Thanks everybody for coming out today. My name is Richard. I work with the committee to set up History Day. It's great to have the event back, great to have such a crowd. One of the key figures in setting up History Day, or a face I see all the time, Bridget, has been very helpful in putting forth this event. Bridget Striker is the director of the Borderlands Archive History Center at the Boone County Public Library. Her department initiatives include African Americans of the Kentucky Borderlands database and grant projects, the Boone County Archive Project, and the 225th anniversary of Boone County event. She's, again, a very valuable worker in local history, and I'm proud to present to you Bridget Striker.
Thank you, Bridget. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I hope you all are enjoying History Day. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
All right, very good. So today we're going to cover the historic African American resources that are available to you, and to look at some of those resources and how we track the folks that we find. One of the things, part of the African Americans of the Kentucky Borderlands initiative, it really started off as an opportunity to document every single African American in Boone County. That's what it started off. Back when I started the department in 2005, there really wasn't a narrative about the African Americans within the county. We knew they were there, but it really wasn't discussed. In 1860, over 20% of the population was African American, and all but 45 of those individuals were enslaved. So this provided us an opportunity to find out who all these folks were. And between 1870 and 1900, there was a migration out of the county. So then by 1900, less than 5% of the population was African American. So the population left, and they left for a variety of reasons, for economic reasons, educational reasons. There was a series of violent events during the 1870s and 1880s, all which led to very pocketed African American communities within the county. And so we wanted the African Americans to have a voice and to know more about who they were. So what we did was we did a systematic review of all the local resources within the county, record by record. And Hillary Delaney, and you'll see her around here today, she was integral in us making an impact and looking at especially the pre-Civil War records that were out there. When I started working on the project in 2005, I basically started with the 1870 and the 1880 census and started just tracking people. And then looking at basic family genealogies and who were the parents, who were the children, could we connect them to grandparents, and just looking at that post-Civil War population. In 2013, we were asked to create an Underground Railroad bus tour for people outside of the community, and so I went, sure. But at that time, we had two escapes that we knew of, the Margaret Garner escape from Richwood, Kentucky, and the Cincinnati 28 escape from northern Boone County. That was it. So I went to Hillary and I said, hey, can you find me some escapes so we can have enough for our bus tour? And by 2014, we had enough for a 60-mile bus tour of the county. And so the nugget of the information that we used to create the database that we're going to talk about was that bus tour. And she kept finding more and more information, and so enough where we could establish a database. So there are many places where we found records over the years: slave narratives, journals of individuals, family papers, newspaper articles, court records, wills and probate. Wills and probate were huge to be able to name the enslaved specifically. Tax records, guardian bonds, census records, freedmen's bank records, military records, and birth and death records. So what we did in the county and what we've subsequently been doing throughout all of northern Kentucky is to look at these records and start building out from the basic level of records that we have, and then use those basic records that we find on Ancestry and Family Search and build out from there to then look for further evidence. Our online resources that we use are Ancestry, Fold3, Family Search, African Americans of the Kentucky Borderlands, which is our database, Newspaper Archive, ProQuest. We've worked with and have connections to the Kentucky African American Heritage Commission with the state, the African American Genealogy Group of Kentucky, and of course the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati. The African American Genealogy Group of Kentucky they have monthly meetings. They have a lot of research that they present at these meetings, and they are a great volunteer group. So when we're looking to expand the research that we will be doing in the future, we were looking specifically at this group as an asset of volunteers and people who really know their communities. The National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, through Family Search and the LES Church, they do offer help with genealogical services for people who are searching for their enslavement connections. And then the Kentucky African American Heritage Commission is actually associated with the Kentucky Heritage Council, which is our state agency that has oversight over historic preservation for the entire state. So this is our site. It is driven by Omeka S. Just real quick, it is an open source database platform that we use to really, so Hillary, when she was doing all of her work, she would dump stuff into spreadsheets, lots and lots and lots of spreadsheets all over the place, right? And we were trying to get a handle on all of her data. So right now we have, it's searchable. What we did was we received funding through actually an Amazon mitigation project for the airport. The airport, there was land that was being converted to Amazon warehousing and distribution, and that project was impacting several sites on their properties, including cemeteries. And there was one particular site that mitigation work is when you have an archaeological site and they do archaeological work on the entire site to then gather as much information as they can, because the site is going to go away, it's being impacted by development. So mitigation is that you're mitigating for the loss of that site by having a project that will then document everything that was going on that site long term. So you're preserving the information about that site without being able to preserve the site itself. One of the sites had some hazmat materials on it, and they were not able to do archaeological investigations. So we received $50,000 to construct the database. So that's what we did. And it now contains over 10,000 records and over 4,000 African American specific information about African American history and individuals. The initial set project, it was over 8,000 records, and it ended up being 143,000 pieces of individual data that we found individually, and then we double-checked to source and make sure it was correct. It was an extensive project. We are now looking to expand this project statewide and get funding to actually do this in every single county for Kentucky. And we're covering enslavement period plus Civil War records. And we're starting to add post-Civil War records. We started specifically with issues of violence and Freedom's Bank information about African Americans, specifically in 1870 and 1880. But as we're doing this, we're also developing all the genealogical information about those African American families. So finding pre-Civil War records, how do we start? We actually started with the slave schedules. And the slave schedules provided us with a background for the database. But what it does is it lists every single enslaver within the county. And then it lists by gender and age every enslaved person in 1850 and 1860. So it's a snapshot. There are no names of enslaved, but what it does is it allows us to get population numbers. But then for like James Marshall, if he passes away before the Civil War, we can then go to his we can go to his will and try to match up these folks who are listed here with the names of the enslaved that he may be distributing to other family members in his will. So this is what it looks like, where you have it just listed, one person, 35 years old, she's female and she's black. One 18-year-old, she's female and she's mulatto. Of course, we don't use the term mulatto in today's terms, but it did mean that this person's children, her children were, she's black, but her children were born of a white father, which has social implications in Kentucky and within Boone County. It's an uncomfortable thing to have to talk about, but in this case, it's important to put the context of this family into the bigger picture of what was going on within the county and within the state. But for us, this allows us, so if James Marshall then died in, let's say, 1853, what we can do then is we can look at if there was an adult female in his house, okay, of about the right age. Let's say her name was Sally. So then we have Sally, and then usually the enslavers in their wills, they will acknowledge the offspring, the children of the enslaved women. And so then we can kind of line up their ages and their genders to the people who were seen in 1850 or 1860. So then we then have a name that we can tie to the individual. And from there, once you have a first name, then you can start looking for last names later on after the Civil War. Do you have any questions about that?
It's amazing work.
It's like a big old puzzle. So pre-Civil War, census records, free people of color. Here, you'll see that the federal census, they were compiled within the general census. And for like 1850, you really had only 33 individuals, and then in 1860, you only had about 45 individuals. Generally, they are people who have been manumitted. Emancipation is when the government frees you. Manumission is when you are freed through local legal means by your enslaver, generally. And so they're listed. In some cases, they're older adults that were manumitted. They had no longer value within as workers within that family context on the enslaver's property, but they probably were still being taken care of on the property by their enslaved children and grandchildren. So that happened quite a bit. And they're also listed as either B for black or M for mulatto under race nationality. Ancestry.com, how we originally got these lists is you can go into 1850 or 1860 and just search Boone County, Federal Census, 1850, and limit by your county, and then also limit by your race nationality, and either put in black or mulatto. You have to do a separate search for black, and you have to do a separate search for mulatto, but you can then get a full picture of who's in that family and who is within the county. Here you'll see, it's hard to read, you have Matt Bates and Dinah Bates right here. And he is 40, Dinah is 50, and they're both listed as black. And they're listed within the context of their white neighbors. So we know exactly where they lived, which neighborhood they were in, and who they were associated with within the context of that neighborhood. Now, a pre-Civil War will records. We talked about how will records are really important. Here's an example of that. Now, we use the term enslaver, and we also use the term slaveholder. You'll see it in both ways in this document. Right now, the preferred terms are moving more towards enslaver. When we constructed the database, the National Park Service preferred the term slaveholder. So that's why you'll kind of see the both in our records. I generally now try to use the term enslaver whenever possible. In the will of William Bates, dated October 1823, he gives 5 of his enslaved to a neighbor, and then he separately releases Matt Bates from enslavement. And remember, we saw Matt Bates in 1850, right? And so this says, also 5 Negro slaves, to wit, Will, about 40 years of age, Phoebe, about 30, Roger, about 18, Jenny, about 16, and Ann, about 16 months, all of which said, John H. Moore and his heirs forever. So Matt Bates had a relationship with Moore, and so the enslaved are still considered property, and they were willed to the neighbor. For the faithful services of my yellow man, Matt, who's about 32 years of age, he is to be set at liberty, and I do hereby will and bequeath him his freedom, which is to take place immediately after my death. So the executors of the will were told, listen, you're setting Matt free. And that was in 1823. And actually, after his wife Peggy died, then the rest of the enslaved. So even though John Moore was really taking care of he was holding all of the enslaved on his property, it looks like at some point Peggy had access to the enslaved, and in her will that she manumitted everyone else. You notice it said yellow man. What does that mean? That means he was mulatto. There is speculation always about why the enslaver would free their enslaved, okay, in a will. For a social context, really you're looking at, the enslavers are within the society that not only is enslavement accepted, it is in some cases thought to be the way you should do things. But a lot of times, the enslaver in their will, they may decide that they don't agree with enslavement, but they don't want to have to face the social consequences of freeing their enslaved while they're still alive. So they wait until that will, and then they free them then. Because Matt Bates was highly considered within the family, there's a good chance that he was biologically related to the Bates family. Peggy and William Bates did not have any children of their own. And when Peggy died, there was money left for the former enslaved. So there's something else going on with that family that we need to look at closely. Nowadays, if we could find descendants of Matt Bates and they were willing to do a DNA test, and you can get some sort of matching line from the white Bates family, you may actually find that they're genetically related. Excuse me. So, pre-Civil War tax records. Each year, slaveholders were required to pay taxes upon the value of their enslaved. Although not listed by name, the enslaved were placed into age and gender categories. Excuse me. This helps a couple different things. It tracks those enslaved in between census periods. It also helps us keep track of whether or not of escapes. So let's say somebody held 10 enslaved in 1851. We know there was an escape in early 1852, and in the 1853 tax records, there's only 4 enslaved left being held by that family. You can then look at large changes in enslavement population within a certain property, and that could be an indicator that there was a larger escape or that there were escapes. So if you have something like Gallatin County, you have something that was like John Sims, held by, John Sims, right? And he escaped across the river. They're looking for him, and that's in a newspaper article. And so you can look at that tax record and see that the slaveholder, the enslaver, lost an enslaved person in between tax years. Then you can use that for verification of that escape. Okay, so Thomas Trundle, okay, we talk about him because he actually was accused of helping enslaved escape. He was accused of being a helper, and in 1853 he was arrested and held in prison, and he ended up dying in the Kent County Jail in Independence. And so we were looking at his numbers specifically because we were trying to figure out, he was an enslaver. So what was it about his enslavement? Like, he had enslaved, but how was he also helping enslaved escape? And one of the things we looked at were his numbers. So he had 4 African American enslaved over the age of 16. He had 13 under the age of 16, which means most of his enslaved were children. And one of the things that we had heard over time was that he was taking in enslaved, he was purchasing enslaved that were in distress, that were in trouble on the properties they were at. And so he was taking his own money, purchasing enslaved, and then protecting them in some way. His is a very complicated story, but you can tell from here that he was clearly not, it was not a great investment for the enslaved on his property. He was spending more money than the value, right? I don't want to be crass, but it tells us that maybe there are multiple ways that you could help on the Underground Railroad. And we do have evidence of people purchasing enslaved and then and manumitting them within a year or two after the purchase, and then sending them across the river, right? Because it was a legal way of freeing people. And so we think that Thomas Trundle was doing something similar. Pre-Civil War birth records. These birth records are super important to give us names and enslaver information. On here, from 1852 through the Civil War, Kentucky counties kept track of enslaved births. Dates of birth, gender, and slaveholder or enslaver was always listed for the child. Sometimes you'd have a name for the child themselves, would also be listed. Very rarely, if ever, you would have the name of the enslaved birth mother. You really wouldn't get that. But you could definitely tell who people were, right? And of course it says that they're black, home of the parents, the mother's name isn't listed, so you get a slash, right? But then you see all of the other names listed under its name of father or owner of the child. So you get that information. In some cases, you get names, sometimes you don't. This gives us verification as we're tracking an individual through time, right? Martha, who's listed and owned by G.J. Gaines, right? She's held by him, right? So I can then look for Martha Gaines in 1870 and 1880, and if the slaveholder passes away, we can track Martha again in those wills, so that we're able to kind of find her, and that's one more piece of who she is, right? And if by any chance there is a will, maybe then we know Martha was born, and maybe it gives her mother's name in the will. So then we look at all these different pieces of information, and we can pull it all together. Journals and letters. Let's get back to Matt Bates. Matt Bates was actually accused of being a conductor on the Underground Railroad. So he was living in Boone County on the river, and there were active escapes all around him, and he was being accused of helping. And in the Chrysler family letters, there has been at least 30 ran off this fall. 14 at and about Burlington, and the rest about Petersburg. And that's in the northern part of the county, right? Abraham Pietz, Thomas Graves, and William Whitaker, who was a neighbor of Matt Bates, all the most valuable. I have no doubt if things continue, enslaved will be scarce near the Ohio River, particularly if old Matt Bates and his clan continues the privilege that they have had. Believe they have been their pilots and is yet, meaning they've been helping people escape along the Ohio River, and they're still doing it today. So this is what made me start looking at Matt Bates, right? And going, oh, who is he? Oh my goodness, he was emancipated or manumitted in 23. His wife manumitted everybody else in the 40s, and oh my gosh, they are living in the county in 1850. But then in 1860, they're not there any longer. So this was November 1852, okay, is when this letter of complaint was issued. 5 months later, the Cincinnati 28 escaped from right near Matt Bates's property. Right after that, Matt Bates drops off the tax list for the county, right? And he's over in Indiana, and he's over in Ohio, and the whole family is over there. And so I believe that the Cincinnati 28 was 28 too many, and they came after him. And interestingly enough, the Bates family, his sons, would keep coming over for work and to be a part of events and church groups and things like that. So they still felt safe enough to do that, but they definitely couldn't continue to live in Boone County. And so it's a great way, these personal letters are a great way of coming up with that bigger picture when you're looking at African American history. Because let's face it, the whole narrative has always been there's no information before 1850 or 1870 for African American family in history. And it's there, you just have to look for it, and you have to be persistent. Finding Civil War records. Fisher Ayler, he served during the Civil War. He was an enslaved person. And so in the records, excuse me, in Ancestry, you find him listed with his name, which troop, the U.S. colored troops. He fought with 117th in Company G. A lot of Boone County boys. They enlisted together in different regiments, and then they served together. So, which is super important after the Civil War for migration, because they would all move together to a new area out of Kentucky. But during the Civil War, you want to fight with people you know, right? Because you know them and you trust them. And so, you find Fisher Ayler, you're also going to find several other people from Boone County all serving together in the same company. And then here is his record and profile. He enlisted in Covington in September 1864. Excuse me. And then he enlisted. He survived the war, and then he died the 2nd of March, 1907, in Dayton, Ohio, at the military hospital. And then down here is his burial record. He died. Body shipped to Covington, Kentucky. And what we know about this is we know his wife is buried in the Florence Cemetery, and because we found this record that his body, for years we thought he was still buried up in Dayton. But because he came home, we believe, even though he doesn't have a marker, there is a sunken plot right next to her, a sunken grave. We believe that's him. And so we have identified that this is the likely place for his burial, was in Florence. You can also look at Fold 3 records. Now, really everywhere where I showed you, it's free access, either through the library or with your at-home subscriptions. They're both available, both Ancestry and Fold 3 are available. And you need to check both resources. I know now Fold 3 gets mined by Ancestry. I would go to Fold 3 directly. I would always go to those databases directly because you're able to find more information, or you can do a different search, use different search criteria than you would be for Ancestry. And here you have his Civil War record, his pension information, and and a memorial also. So there's a few different records for him. And of course, you can also check Freeman's Bank records as well. Finding post-Civil War records. Do you have any questions so far? Yes.
Yeah, so you talked about how you could see on the census pre-Civil War, the number of enslaved, and
Yes.
then he had a way of guessing how many might have escaped. But what about deaths?
You would have deaths. Now, something that is very interesting, you also have, not only do you have a birth record, you also have death records listed the same way. So we check all that as well. We use that to find patterns of the health of the farm. Okay? So you'll have a situation where there's cholera or there's influenza, and you could have several people passing away. In that case, you usually see them as older individuals and as young children. There are some farms that we suspect had malnutrition, right? They were not a wealthy farm. And not only do you see deaths among the enslaved, you also see similar deaths among the white family members as well. And
So there would be an actual death record.
there would be an actual death record. Now, before 1852, there's not, but then you look at patterns, right? And you look at patterns in the tax records, and then because you can look at cemetery records for the white family members, and if the white family members had some sort of catastrophic health event in that family, and then you see a large number of enslaved dropping off the slave schedules or the tax records from one year to the next, you can suspect. One of the things to note is that generally in Boone, absolutely in Boone County and most of rural Kentucky, they're not going to take land to make a separate cemetery for enslaved. What they do is they segregate the family cemetery. So the prominent family members are usually, the cemeteries are east to west. More prominent family members are either in the center or the front, the east side of the cemetery. And then to the back, to the west of the cemetery, you will find the enslavement burials. They generally do not have, they're marked, but they're marked with field stones set up on edge. You can definitely tell that it's not the same as the rest of the cemetery. And you'll see them in rows. And so you can tell where they should be, but they may not be documented. Or they could be documented like Dinsmore Homestead. They journaled everything, right? They kept a list of everything that happened on that farm. And they would also list the enslaved deaths, right? And so you can then come up with a name, and then they'll say, we buried them here. And so then you can tell that they're within, off to the west of the family cemetery. They will always be segregated because Christian belief back then was that at the second coming of Christ, you rise, the dead will rise to meet Christ, right? And so they're buried with their feet to the east, their head to the west, right? The headstone is at the west. Their footstone is at the east. So when they rise up, they're facing Christ, okay?
He comes from the east.
He comes from the
It
east.
comes from the east. Exactly.
Who knew?
And you don't necessarily want your enslaved person to meet Christ before you do. So they have to be at the back of the cemetery. It is a consistent pattern within our family cemeteries here. And actually the Florence Cemetery, at one point, the segregated section of the cemetery, we believe, was a separate cemetery with a separate entrance. But of course now it's all one cemetery. But the African Americans are definitely buried to the back of that cemetery, with one small exception. So it's consistent. And so when you're looking at cemeteries, if you have a section of a cemetery that is not well kept, it's back in the woods, and you see a cemetery, but it looks like the boundaries used to be somewhere else, or you see sunken grave shafts and no stones or broken stones, and it's to the west, most likely those are African American burials. Post-Civil War. So did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, good. Veterans records, we talked about that a little bit earlier. We're also going to talk about Jacob Pyatt, who is super interesting because he had an alias of Jacob Ryle. He was from Boone County, and this gives an alias for him. It indicates his widow, Maria A. Pyatt, filed for a widow's pension, in 89. He was born and enslaved in Boone County in 1835, and he died in Oxford in 1887. What's interesting about him is up in the Lane Public Library, up in Oxford, they actually have letters between the former enslaver, the woman, and Jacob. They have letters between the two of them after the Civil War that talks about, oh, this is what's going on the farm, you know, because Jacob had, we believe he actually escaped, and we have some information about that. But what happened is they would escape, they would join the Union Army, they would fight, then they would come back after the war, gather their family, and again, they would all migrate together. So the 117th, they actually all fought, after the Civil War, they all moved to Oxford together, and they settled there as a community. And how I found out about that was the local history librarian up there, she saw a program of mine in Connorsville, Indiana, where I was talking about the migration there, and she said, we have a lot of the same names in the black community up in Oxford. Can you research that for me? I went, yes. And nearly the entire population of African Americans in 1900 were descended from Boone County enslaved. It was amazing, and it was very cool. But here are some records for him, and it looks like he also served in the heavy artillery. So here he is in the Veterans Schedule 1890. He's listed as Jacob Ryle. The name spelling is different, but it doesn't matter. Maria Pyatt is listed as his widow, although he is listed as Ryle instead of Pyatt. All the veterans were listed together. Whether they were black or white, everybody was listed together. The difference is that there was a C. Okay? If you see this little squiggly C, if you're looking at the veterans schedule, they're African American. Okay? But that's the only place where it's listed. So you need to check the entire record to find the information, okay? And it says, it gives his name is Jacob Ryle, which tells us that he probably enlisted under Jacob Ryle. Remember that other enlistment form we had for him. And that Maria Pyatt is her married name. And I can't remember what her maiden name is right off the top of my head. She was also enslaved in Boone County. So he came back and got her, and then they moved together to up into Oxford. And here is his obituary. Died in Oxford, Ohio on Monday evening, April 4th, Jacob Pyatt, in the 53rd year of his age. He was born in Boone County, Kentucky, December 14th, 1835, and remained a slave until the war. When liberated, he enlisted in the U.S. Army and served his country faithfully. Since the war, he made his home in Oxford. He was a quiet, faithful, industrious man, winning friends wherever he was known. He was a member of the old John Brown Post number 450. So that was a black Civil War veterans group, right? We need to look at more of these names. So you can get a list of those from up in Oxford and then start looking at those associations. And was buried by his comrades, the commander, his brother-in-law, being among the mourners. Okay, so who's that commander? So they're now related by marriage. And services were held at the Christian church of which he was a consistent member. Where are their church records? Let's look at those church records. Benjamin Ayers had command of the post. Okay, so Benjamin Ayers is his brother-in-law, right? Wow. So let's look at Ayers' wife, and who is she related to? Jacob, who marched with the body of their deceased comrade to his last resting place. Soldier, rest, thy warfare o'er. Sleep the sleep that knows no waking. Dream of battlefields no more. Days of slumber, nights of waking. And that was in the Oxford Citizen in 1887. So now you're tying in those newspapers, right? You still have to do a separate search because you want to make sure you do a systematic search of all the records. Does it take a lot of time? Yes. Do you have to be persistent? Yes. One of the reasons why you create a spreadsheet of the information, especially if you're searching for it within a community, is you may find somebody else other than Jacob Hyatt at first, so you want to write down where you found that information, so you're not going back 3 months later going, I knew I saw something about Jim Poston, where is he? You know, and then you're trying to recreate your search. How am I doing on time? And so this death notice was found on newspapers.com. So sometimes they're paid databases, sometimes you can get free access through your library, but you should check everything. Okay, and find a grave. Find a grave can be useful in identifying the resting place. But because it's a self-reporting site, please be careful when you're linking your information to it. Go and verify. I took this photo. I knew where he was. He is in the Woodside Cemetery in Oxford, and that's primarily an African-American cemetery. And I basically walked through the cemetery and started writing down the names of all the veterans, and then I went back and I researched them like, oh, he was Boone County. Oh, he was Boone County. Oh, he was also Boone County.
Wow.
And then you can see the associated families. So this is where you have, again, alias Jack Ryle, served as a private in Battery L, 13th U.S. Colored Troops Heavy Artillery. Also served in Company G, the 72nd Troops Infantry. So this is where he's buried. And so I was able to verify his information. Yes?
So the change of name, do you think that it reflects back to the former enslaver
Yes.
being Ryle and then choosing a different name? Is that what that's?
So for enslaved, they were trying to keep the names separate. So if Jacob Ryle went and eventually worked on a Hyatt farm, they wanted to make sure, the enslavers wanted to make sure they understand who exactly he was and which farm he came from. You don't want to be vulgar, but there were reasons why they needed to keep track of the genealogies of their enslaved.
And then for Jacob as a free person to change his name.
He could. Now, sometimes what they did was if they're a freedom seeker, they will change their name to something similar so that other freedom seekers who may be related to them will still be able to find them. But it may provide them with an ability to, say, give them a little bit of protection from slave catchers. But also, it's the difference of taking your mother's name and your father's name. So it could be that his biological father was a Piot. It could be that the family he identified with was a Piot. Yes, he was likely held at one point by a Ryle. And it could be that his mother was held by the Ryles, and that's where that name came from. Yeah.
Just real quick, changing names was not just something African American soldiers did. A lot of the white soldiers did the same too, or at least some of them.
Okay.
And let's face it, when you were getting in the Army at that time, they didn't exactly do a background check. You'd be 16 years old, you tell them you're 18 and your name is Bill Clinton, they're going to believe you and put it in too. Mm-hmm. So it's not, obviously slavery and freedom probably an issue, but it's not only African Americans that did that.
Thank you for that point. For in our case, we do know that he's in the database, and so I don't have it right off the top of my head, but we do have the information regarding the enslaver, and he was a Ryle. He was a Ryle, but with a Pied association, and it's the same with his wife Maria. You also have the Freedmen's Bureau in the bank. It was originally set up for the U.S. Colored Troops veterans, just because they were getting out of the military after the war, and white banks in their communities were not permitting them to deposit their paychecks. So the federal government was like, hold on. And so they established banks. Only in the states where they were enslaved or there was an issue. Like, I don't believe you see Freedmen's Bank really in Ohio or Indiana or Michigan, but it's definitely in Kentucky and South. In Kentucky, they had a division at Lexington and a division at Louisville. I don't believe there was anywhere else in the West. So they would have to travel to deposit their funding, their money. In this case, it's Viney Allen. The date of her deposit was February 21st, 1872. She was born in Florence, Kentucky. She was brought up partly there and here, so we need to figure out, and she's living in Nashville. So at one time, in this case, so she was born in Florence, but at some point she was transferred down to Nashville. How could that? She was still a child, so she could have been sold. She could have been given to a family member who was moving down to that area. A lot of times, young enslaved girls were used as dress servants for young white girls within the family, and then they would be then deeded over to those girls when they got married, and that's how they would transfer that. That's just reality. So then we can look for Viney Allen and see if that's her maiden name or her married name, and then we can kind of see if we can track her movement down to Nashville. She's a cook. She works for William Sinek. Her husband is Campbell. Her father was Adam. Her mother was Patsy. Great information, right? So then we are looking for, and if his last name is Campbell, then she's an Adam or Allen, and so then we can look for probably Patsy and see if she was moved down south with Patsy. And she knows that they're both deceased, or she thinks they are. She knows her brothers and sisters, Fielding and Randall, and then Lucinda in Boone County. So then we look for Fielding, Allen, Randall, and Lucinda in Boone County. Tremendous amount of genealogical information. And the deposit was made by Campbell. Okay? And so this right now, a great place to look for Freedmen's information is the Family Search Database. There are lots of people who are doing lots of research with the Freedmen's Bank records. It's not all well indexed. You have to be persistent. Okay? Here is our information. Do you have any questions for me? Yes.
So you mentioned at the beginning that you were in the process of extending this database research to statewide.
Yes.
How does your database work compare with, or I guess, are there in other states, and is there any national, that coordinates all this sort of thing?
Michigan State has a project in enslave.org, and they are acquiring data from different databases. So you have mostly local sort of projects that are happening. A lot of them are through academic organizations. universities, things like that. And they're compiling all that data together. We have been asked to give our data to Michigan State. We are not going to do that. The reason why we're not going to do that is, one, we're not done. And two, I think it's important for Kentucky, first of all, it's important for the United States, people across the country, to acknowledge the work that Kentucky's doing, because we're doing work. And two, they can link to our data, but once we give our data to somebody else, then we don't have control over what that looks like. For instance, in the Michigan State database, they talk about Margaret Garner, who was born, raised, and saw her freedom from Boone County. The information that is in the database currently is not correct for Margaret Garner. Our data is correct, but if they're both into the data, in the database at Michigan State, then they're going to look at the two sets of data and people can decide which one they want to use. I would rather they not do that. Our data is correct. We've spent decades looking at Margaret Garner. So yes, enslaved.org is a great resource. There is also, and the name escapes me right now, a database where they're looking at escape ads in newspapers. And then you can go online and you can go ahead and volunteer to like transcribe the newspaper articles and put in all the information. That's a good one. So it's really more of a local or state focus for this. The reason why we want to expand this out to the state is because it works, right? So we did our testing. We're going to do some beta testing in Gallatin County because we have a working relationship with the Gallatin County Public Library. And we've worked with them on some other projects. So it will be easy to kind of get them to work within our structure. And then Library of Congress just gave us $12,000 to mine Kentucky information about African Americans from their data sets at the Library of Congress. And so then we're going to pull that information into our database as well, right? But it'll link back out to the Library of Congress. So everything is super well cited. And then we're going to look at a Network to Freedom grant to look at all of northern Kentucky, okay? We've done quite a bit for all of northern Kentucky, but it's been kind of like accidental as Hillary and the rest of us have been doing work. We've been pulling information. But now, systematic, looking at that 1850 census, looking at that 1860 census, and come up with the structure for each county. And then we're looking at possibly getting an NEH grant, which is substantially more, to then do all along the Ohio River. And Lexington, Louisville, and Bowling Green. Get these big chunky metro areas done, and then all along the Ohio River. And then from there, we can start filling in all the other counties. Excuse me. So that's the plan.
Yeah.
It's doable. It's going to take a while, but we can get it done. How's that for an answer? Is that for you to answer?
That's very good. I was going to ask similar, but you answered it.
Thank you. Yeah, and so we know that our data is valuable because the National Park Service is actually using our data that we don't have online yet, like Lexington. Lexington has some sites they want to put on the Network to Freedom. And they're using all of our data for Fayette County to kind of determine where to create those Network to Freedom sites. So they're using the data anyway, it might as well be in the database where everybody can see it.
I have a question. Is Bracken County involved in helping you out? Because I live in Augusta, and I know that there was a lot of movement there. We have a lot of...
There was. We have not done outreach to there yet. We would love to do outreach there. We've been talking to Pendleton County. Campbell County, things like that. I'm gonna give you my card.
Okay,
You all need to contact me because we can get you started.
that will be very good, because I'm working in two others. My wife has got a project that she's working with the
Perfect.
boats.
And what we do with the database is, once your data is in the county, there's two different things that we do. First of all, it's cited where the information came from. So it's not just like, hey, we got this new information. No, information came from Bracken County, it came from Pendleton County, right? But then also, we can set it up on your historical society page where you can literally just execute a search, excuse me, just for Bracken County records in the database. So, you know, they could go to the overall database, but if they're specifically looking at Bracken County, here's all your information that you've contributed.
That's great.
Yeah, because we don't want to take, it's your information. And we want to acknowledge that it's your information and it's going to be your hard work.
Okay, that's good.
Yep. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.